I joked. "If you were 45, I'd go traveling with you." She didn't blink. She smiled, slow, deliberate, and said, "I'm 55. Is that an issue for you?" Right there, in the middle of a half-busy cafe, with the sun hitting her face just enough to catch the silver in her hair, I knew I'd messed up. Not because I was wrong, not because I was trying to be cruel, but because I had underestimated her and she saw it. The joke was never meant to land. It was filler, something light in a conversation that had stretched too long into something comfortable. But she took it, flipped it, and dropped it on the table between us like a challenge wrapped in grace. I had nothing to say. Because what I realized in that moment, the way her eyes didn't leave mine, the way she let the silence sit, was that she wasn't waiting for reassurance. She was waiting to see if I was worth continuing the conversation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. We'd met 3 days earlier at a hostel in Lisbon. Not the kind of hostel where you come to party, but one of those quiet, well-kept spaces tucked above a bookstore. The kind of place where the rooms are clean, the sheets are always sun-dried, and the people passing through carry journals and grief in equal measure. She was sitting at the communal table with a cup of tea and a leather-bound notebook when I walked in, dragging my bag and trying to look like I knew what I was doing. She looked up and said hello before I did. That was the first clue. Most people in hostels, especially older ones, keep to themselves. But she didn't move like someone who needed to be invisible. She made space like she already knew the room would shift for her if she gave it time. And that intrigued me, even before I knew why. I was 32, aimless, running from the echo of a breakup I hadn't properly grieved. The trip wasn't planned. It was booked at midnight with 2 glasses of whiskey and a promo code. Portugal felt far enough from who I'd been a month ago. I told myself I needed time to figure things out. What I needed, actually, was silence. Or clarity. Or someone who didn't look at me like I was broken in a way that needed to be fixed. And for whatever reason, she didn't. That night, we talked for almost 3 hours. About books, about trains, about where we'd been, and why we weren't in those places anymore. She told me she used to work in publishing, but left it behind. I told her I used to know who I was, but hadn't met that version of myself in a while. She nodded at that. Not with pity, but understanding. Over the next 2 days, we kept finding ourselves in the same spaces. Morning coffee on the balcony, a shared plate of sardines at a corner bar, a walk back from the market where we talked. About cities we both hated for different reasons. She never asked personal questions unless they came up naturally. Never tried to fix me. Never once treated me like I was young or foolish. And that, more than anything, pulled me in. She didn't need me to impress her. She just needed me to be present. And in the beginning, that felt easy. But ease has a funny way of making people reckless. So when I made the joke about her age, it wasn't malice. It was comfort. I was too at ease. I forgot who I was sitting across from. I forgot that some people don't accept being minimized, even accidentally, especially not by someone who hasn't earned the right to tease. And when she answered so calmly, so directly, I realized I wasn't in control of the story like I thought. She had been from the start. Because while I'd been treating this like a warm distraction in a beautiful city, she'd been watching, listening, measuring, not in a manipulative way, in a wise way. And that made me sit up straighter. The truth was, she didn't look 55. Not in the way most people define it. Her face had lines, sure, and her hands showed time, but nothing about her felt old. She moved like someone who had long ago stopped caring whether the world approved of her existence. And that's what threw me. I was used to people trying to prove themselves. She wasn't. She already had, to herself. That made my little joke feel small and stupid in a way that embarrassed me more than I let on. She didn't stay much longer that afternoon. Paid her bill, told me she was going to a museum, and said I was welcome to join. No guilt, no awkward energy. Just an open door, and I didn't know why, but I didn't go. I watched her walk away, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was watching someone move forward without needing me in the frame. That night, I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering why her question. echoed so loudly in my head. Is that an issue for you? At first I thought it was about age, but the more I turned it over, the more I knew it wasn't. It was about expectation. About whether I had the capacity to meet someone where they were, not where I wanted them to be. And the thing that scared me most wasn't that she was older. It was that she wasn't afraid of time, and I was. Still am. Maybe, just maybe, that's why I needed to see her again. I didn't see her the next morning. Her usual spot on the balcony was empty, the chair pushed in neatly, mug missing from its place on the small iron table. I told myself it didn't matter, that I hadn't expected her to stay long anyway. Most people pass through Lisbon like a breeze, soft, brief, untraceable. But I felt it. That absence, it wasn't sharp, but it was present. Like missing a smell you didn't know you loved until it disappeared. I sat with my coffee longer than usual, checking my phone without purpose, pretending to read and replaying our last exchange in my head, like it had more weight than it probably did. If she had been offended, she hadn't shown it. If she had brushed me off, she'd done it with grace. But still, the words hung over me. I'm 55. Is that an issue for you? I kept hearing it, not as a confrontation, but as a mirror. And I didn't like what I saw in my reflection. Around midday, I left the hostel and wandered. That's what I'd been doing most of the trip, walking without a plan, hoping to stumble into something meaningful. That day, I ended up in Alfama, one of the oldest parts of the city, with winding cobbled streets that didn't bother pretending to make sense. I ducked into a small cafe for lunch, the kind of place with plastic tablecloths and a chalkboard. Menu and handwriting no tourist app could decipher. I sat alone, ordered sardines and potatoes, and stared at my journal like it owed me answers. For the first time since arriving, I wasn't thinking about my ex, or my job, or what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. I was thinking about her, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the way she paused before responding like she was actually considering the weight of her words, the way she never once asked me what I did for work or where I saw myself. In 5 years, everyone else always asked those questions. She didn't. She asked about feelings, moments, memory, music. I realized then that I didn't know her last name, and that bothered me more than it should have. By the time I made it back to the hostel, the sky had begun to darken. I passed the communal lounge and stopped at the front desk, half hoping she'd extended her stay, half afraid to ask. Before I could decide what to do, I heard her voice low, unmistakable from the kitchen. Something unspooled in my chest at that sound. I followed it. She was sitting at the corner of the long wooden table, a half-empty glass of red wine in front of her, talking to a girl who couldn't have been more than 21, nodding as she listened to some tale about night trains and lost passports. She saw me, but didn't let it disrupt her. She just smiled. Subtle. A note in the margin. I waited until the girl excused herself, then slid into the chair across from her without asking. She poured herself more wine and offered the bottle without a word. I poured, then sipped, then said nothing. The silence between us was warmer this time. She asked how my day had been. I told her the truth, that I'd spent most of it walking around and thinking about our last conversation. She raised her brow at that, not with skepticism, but with interest. I told her I didn't mean for the joke to land the way it did, that I hadn't thought, that I wasn't used to being around someone who made me want to. She nodded, said that was fair. Then she asked, gently, what I had meant by it. I said I didn't know. Maybe that I'd always thought connection had a type, a range, a window that made sense. She smiled, not unkindly, and asked if I'd ever actually felt something that made sense, that made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was honest. The answer was no. And that truth sat between us, balancing the weight of everything else. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That night, we didn't leave the hostel. We sat at that table for hours talking about how time changes what you think you need, how being wanted isn't the same as being seen. She told me about a man she almost married when she was 27, about how she'd sabotaged it without realizing why. I told her about the version of myself I'd built to survive the last relationship, and how I wasn't sure I even liked him. We didn't flirt. We didn't touch. But something in the air cracked open. She told me she didn't mind being 55, that she actually liked it. It was the first decade she felt like she didn't owe anyone her softness unless they'd earned it. I told her I was afraid of aging because I hadn't figured out who I was yet, and I thought time was supposed to deliver that. She told me it didn't. She said time just strips away the distractions. The rest, you have to look for it yourself. By midnight, the kitchen had emptied. The wine was gone. We walked back to our rooms in silence. Before she went into hers, she turned and said, "If I were 45, you'd travel with me. But you're here, and so am I. Maybe that's more interesting." Then she disappeared behind the door, and I stood in the hallway staring at the number on her room like it meant something more than wood and brass. I didn't sleep much that night. I didn't dream. I just laid there staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe age had nothing to do with anything. Maybe connection doesn't care about the math. Maybe all it asks is that you show up completely when it finally arrives. And for the first time in a long time, I wanted to show up. Not just for her. For me, the next morning the air felt cooler. That kind of quiet chill that makes a city feel brand new even if you've already walked every alley twice. I woke up earlier than usual, not out of excitement, but because something in me had shifted subtle, like the way light changes right before it rains. My thoughts weren't racing, but they were focused. I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. Maybe it was more interesting we were here now, in this moment, rather than in some hypothetical window that would have made more sense. On paper, I kept replaying that one line in my head, not for what it implied, but for what it revealed that she'd been listening, not just to my words, but to what was underneath them. And that scared me. Not because I didn't want to be seen, because I didn't know what I'd do with that level of visibility. I didn't see her at breakfast. Her spot at the communal table was taken by a French couple arguing quietly over a guidebook. I poured myself a cup of bitter hostel coffee and wandered to the balcony, half hoping I'd catch a glimpse of her walking in, half bracing for the idea that she might be gone. The thing about people like her is they move like water fluid, steady, impossible to contain. If she decided her time here was up, she wouldn't announce it. She'd just vanish with the same grace she arrived with. And the only proof she'd been there at all would be how different you felt after. I sat with that thought, legs stretched across the bench, sun warming my shoulders, and for once didn't try to distract myself. I just let myself feel it, whatever it was. Curiosity, regret, nervousness, interest, it all blended into something I didn't have language for yet, but I knew it had weight. I knew it had to be followed. Around 10 she appeared. Like the universe had heard me getting too comfortable with disappointment. She was wearing jeans and a white linen shirt, hair pulled back into a low knot, sunglasses perched on her head like an afterthought. She didn't say good morning like people do out of habit. She said it like she meant it. Like the fact that we were both still in the same place was something to be acknowledged. I offered her the extra cup of coffee I'd poured just in case. She took it. We didn't sit at the table. We leaned against the railing side by side, looking out over the tiled rooftops like we were pretending this was our view every morning. And maybe that's what made it feel dangerous, not because we were lying to ourselves, but because part of me wanted it to be true. She asked if I had plans. I didn't. She said she wanted to show me something. A monastery on the edge of the city, quiet and half forgotten, the kind of place tourists overlooked and locals protected. Took the tram shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat between us. She told me about the architecture, the history, things she'd read in a book she'd lost years ago. I asked questions, not to keep the conversation alive, but because I wanted to hear her speak. Her voice made things feel settled. Like no matter how chaotic the world got, there was someone in it who had already made peace with her own contradictions. The tram rocked gently as it climbed. At one point, I caught myself looking at her reflection in the window instead of the view. There was something about the lines near her mouth, the way her jaw set when she was focused, that felt more beautiful than any postcard scene. The monastery was empty except for a gardener trimming vines and a stray cat sleeping in a sunbeam. The walls were white, the sky above a shade of blue that looked like it hadn't been touched in centuries. We didn't talk much. We walked through corridors, across stone steps, into quiet chapels that smelled like dust and memory. At the point we stopped in a courtyard, with cracked fountains and wild grass pushing through the cracks. She sat on a bench and looked up at the sky, then closed her eyes like she was listening for something I couldn't hear. I sat beside her, not speaking, not needing to. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't said yet, and I realized then that I didn't want to leave this moment. Not today, not soon. I didn't know what that meant yet, or what I'd have to do to make space for it, but the feeling was clear. When she opened her eyes, she looked at me like she already knew what I was thinking. I asked her how long she was staying. She said she hadn't decided. Then she asked me the same. I told her the truth. I was supposed to leave in 3 days. She didn't react, just nodded. Then she asked what I was actually looking for. In Lisbon, in life. I started to answer with something easy, something vague, but her face stopped me. She wasn't making conversation. She was offering me a door. I told her I didn't know, that I thought I had known, that for a while I thought love meant finding someone who fit a checklist, same age, same taste, same goals. But lately, I'd started to wonder if love was actually about something else entirely. About timing, about recognition, about seeing someone and feeling like the version of you that shows up around them is the one you've been trying to meet your whole life. She didn't respond right away. I just reached out, placed her hand gently over mine, and let it rest there like an answer. We left the monastery as the sun began to dip. The tram ride back was quieter, the city golden and humming. When we reached the stop near the hostel, we stood on the sidewalk for a minute like neither of us wanted to move first. She asked if I wanted to join her for dinner. I said yes, before I even knew what I was saying. And in that yes, I felt something anchor, not certainty, not commitment, just the start of something that finally felt real. Dinner was slow and quiet, tucked into a restaurant she knew just off the tram line, the kind of place with mismatched chairs, candles already lit before dusk, and a waiter who nodded at her like an old friend. We didn't open menus. She ordered for both of us, without hesitation. 2 glasses of red wine and something I didn't catch the name of, and I didn't mind. It felt like she had been here many times, in many versions of herself, and I was stepping into a space where she was already whole. The food came fast and warm. Roasted fish, lemon potatoes, something green that tasted better than it looked. We ate slowly. She didn't talk much, and neither did I, but the silence didn't stretch awkwardly between us. It folded, held like a tablecloth settling under the weight of shared time. Her fingers moved while she spoke along the edge of her glass, across. The linen napkin in her lap, gestures that meant nothing and somehow everything. I found myself memorizing them without trying. The way you memorize a song that's already part of you. At one point, the conversation turned to her travels. She spoke of Morocco, of narrow streets and rooftop markets, and heat that didn't break until midnight. She told me about Istanbul, about losing herself in alleyways and a man who once tried to convince her to stay with him forever after only 2 days. She laughed at that memory, soft and distant, and said she'd left him with a note and a bottle of cologne. There was no bitterness in her stories, no regret, just a string of moments stitched together by curiosity and movement. I asked her if she ever felt lonely. She looked at me like I'd asked something too obvious to answer, then said no, not lonely, just aware. Aware of time, of people, of how rare it is to find someone who doesn't require translation. She said most people want connection, but they don't want to do the work of being understood. They want mirrors, not windows. That line stuck with me. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I knew it was true. After dinner, we walked. Nowhere in particular. The air was cool, the streetlights soft, casting long shadows across cobblestone. She didn't hold my hand, and I didn't offer mine, but we stayed close. Steps in sync, words falling into rhythm. She asked about my last relationship, not the surface story, but the real one. The parts that still echoed when I was alone. I hesitated, then told her about the misalignment. about the way I tried to shrink myself to keep the peace, about how I had started editing my thoughts before I spoke, until eventually there was nothing left to say. She didn't pity me. She didn't analyze. She just listened, like she had a room inside her for holding other people's stories. And mine had found a spot without needing to knock. We stopped near the edge of a fountain, the kind people throw coins into when they're out of wishes but still hopeful. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a €1 coin, and handed it to me. I asked what for. She said to let something go. Not a wish, a wait. I thought about it, really thought. Then I closed my hand around the coin and held it to my chest. For a second, before tossing it into the water, the sound was small, but it rippled. She didn't ask what I let go of, and I didn't tell her. But in that moment, something shifted. Quiet release. Like loosening your grip on something you didn't realize had been clenched for too long. Back at the hostel, we paused at the hallway again, that same long stretch of silence. But this time she didn't turn toward her door right away. She looked at me, eyes steady, and said, I don't collect men. I don't chase intensity for sport. But I also don't ignore it when something feels alive. My throat dried, not from fear. From recognition. I nodded, told her I felt the same. She smiled, that same small smile from the cafe, the one that disarmed me the first day, and said, Good. Then let's not ruin it by rushing toward it. Then she opened her door and disappeared again, slow and certain, like she was walking back into herself. I stood there in the hallway for a long time, long after her door clicked shut. Not frozen, not confused, just processing. 'Cause I wasn't. Used to connection feeling like this, so grounded, so mature, so wildly present without demanding anything. She wasn't performing. She wasn't leaning on flirtation or charm. She wasn't asking me to be anyone I wasn't. And in her presence, I didn't feel like I had to fix myself to be worthy. I just had to show up. Fully, consistently, with all the sharp edges and soft spots I usually tried to tuck away. And that terrified me. But it also made me feel more human than I had in years. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. Only this time it wasn't anxiety, it was clarity. I wasn't trying to figure her out. I was trying to figure myself out around her. There's a difference. One is about control, the other is about capacity. And I think for the first time, I wanted to grow not because I was broken, but because I'd met someone who made growing feel like a gift, not a punishment. Someone who didn't need me to catch up, but who wouldn't slow down just to make me comfortable either. The room felt still. My heartbeat felt louder than it should have. I wanted to text her, just to say something, anything. But I didn't, because she was right. Whatever this was, whatever it could become, didn't need to be rushed. It just needed to be respected. The next day felt different before it even began. The light through the hostel window hit at a softer angle, and everything in the room looked slightly more defined, like I was suddenly seeing it all in higher resolution. I moved slower, getting dressed, lingered longer over my coffee, found myself checking the hallway more than once. I told myself it was nothing, that this wasn't a story I was stepping into, just a conversation that hadn't yet finished. But underneath the calm I tried to wear like armor, something was building. Not anxiety, not obsession.
Ow.
Something quieter, but heavier. A pull. And I knew that if I wasn't careful, I'd either lean into it too fast or run from it too soon. And both options felt like a betrayal of whatever we'd started to create. I found her near the back courtyard, where the hostel's worn wooden benches wrapped around a few raised garden beds that hadn't seen rain in weeks. She was writing again. Her notebook open on one knee, pen moving like it had its own rhythm. I watched for a moment before saying anything, mostly just to see how it looked her in that light, surrounded by ivy and morning silence. Like she belonged to a version of the world the rest of us were too distracted to notice.
Oh, when I finally
Stepped into view, she looked up and smiled. Not surprised. Like she'd known I'd come. Like part of her had waited just enough without needing to say it out loud. We didn't make plans. We just started walking, south this time, away from the center of the city. Toward neighborhoods where laundry hung from windows and the sidewalks narrowed until we had to walk single file. She led the way, stopping now and then to point out an old mosaic, a doorframe painted with the kind of care that comes from pride, not money. I didn't ask where we were going. It didn't feel like the kind of day that needed a destination. Eventually, we wound up at a small overlook where the city fell away into water, and the hills beyond looked like a painting someone had almost finished, but decided to leave imperfect. She sat on the stone wall, legs dangling, the breeze pulling. At the edges of her shirt, stood beside her, arms crossed, trying not to stare. She asked about my childhood. Not the surface stuff, the grades, the sports, the family trips, but the feeling of it. She asked if I'd been safe, if I'd felt loved, if I'd ever been taught how to sit still with myself without needing to prove anything. The questions weren't invasive. They were invitations. And for reasons I didn't fully understand, I answered them honestly. I told her I'd grown up in a house where silence meant tension and where love felt conditional, always hanging on how well I performed. I told her I'd learned to read rooms better than I could read myself, and that most of my relationships were built on being what someone else needed. She listened, not with pity, but with attention so complete it felt like therapy disguised as conversation, and she told me she used to confuse stillness with loneliness until she realized one required presence and the other required absence. She said the trick was learning the difference between peace and detachment. I didn't fully understand it then, but I would later. We wandered again after that, found a bookstore tucked behind a wine bar, lost an hour thumbing through used paperbacks. Stopping now and then to read passages to each other, she found a copy of a poetry collection she said once changed her entire outlook on aging. She handed it to me, open to a dog-eared page, and let me read the stanza in silence. It spoke of time not as an enemy, but as a lens, how the years weren't something to beat back, something to learn how to see through. I read it 3 times before looking up. She was watching me again, but not like she was waiting for it. Reaction. More like she was watching to see if I'd let the words settle somewhere deeper than my brain by the time we made it back to the hostel. The sun had shifted low, turning everything gold. We stood by the front steps, not quite ready to go in. There was something charged in the air now, something electric, but quiet. I could feel it in my chest, in the space between my hand and hers. I wanted to touch her, not out of impulse, but reverence, like I was approaching something sacred. But I didn't. Not yet. She looked at me then, not like a woman waiting to be kissed, but like someone deciding if she'd allow it. Not because she was holding power, but because she understood the cost of opening a door that couldn't be closed again. And I think in that moment, she saw the war in my head, the tug between fear and want, between risk and restraint. She smiled barely, just enough. Then said she was going to shower before dinner. Told me I could join if I wanted, not the shower, the dinner. I nodded, and she left me there on the steps, hands in my pockets, the sky bleeding pink above my head. The sound of the city soft around the edges, and for the first time, I realized this wasn't just attraction. This was becoming a choice. Dinner. That evening took place in a different part of town. Somewhere north of where we'd wandered earlier, in a low-lit bistro tucked between 2 alleys where vines crawled up. The walls like the building had been trying to disappear for years, but never quite managed. She had picked the place, of course, and it was exactly the kind of setting that fit her, quiet, warm, effortlessly elegant without trying too hard. We sat by a window, the flicker of candlelight bouncing off the glass and making everything inside feel a little slower, a little softer. The waiter brought a bottle of red, no menu again, just her giving a short nod and a few words in Portuguese that landed like a private language between them. I had never felt so content to be out of control. With her, it wasn't disempowering. It was freeing. Like I could finally stop trying to impress someone, just to be accepted, and start letting someone see me, just because I wanted to be understood. The food came and went, but the conversation didn't. We talked about the places we still wanted to go. She said she wanted to spend a summer in the Greek islands, not with tourists, but in the villages, with old women who made bread before dawn and men who fished because they didn't know how not to. I said I wanted to drive through the American Southwest, just me and a map, and maybe an old car that smelled like leather and stories. She smiled at that, said it sounded lonely in a beautiful way, and I told her that maybe lonely things were only ugly when you didn't choose them. We didn't linger after dessert. She stood and said, "Let's walk," and I followed. The streets were quieter now, the kind of quiet where footsteps echo and headlights feel like they belong in another world. We didn't hold hands, but the space between our arms kept shrinking until our elbows brushed. I noticed how easily our bodies moved in tandem, how neither of us needed to adjust to match pace. That simple harmony, unspoken and unplanned, hit me harder than any compliment ever could. It meant something to walk through a city with someone and not feel like you were chasing or being dragged. We ended up back near the hostel, though neither of us mentioned going in. Instead, we paused by the entrance, standing beneath a street lamp that flickered now and then, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to participate. She looked at me, then at the sky, then back again. I realized that the moment was asking for something. Not a move, not a line, just honesty. Real, clean honesty. I told her I wasn't used to this, that I didn't even know what this was yet, but it felt like something real, something I hadn't touched in years. She nodded, said that was good, that too many people rushed to define things just to feel safe. She said that what we were doing, being present, being aware, being curious without expectation, was already rare. I asked if she felt the tension between us, and she laughed lightly, not out of discomfort, but because she clearly had felt it first. She stepped closer then, and her hand grazed mine, and I thought, here it is. But instead of leaning in, she tilted her head slightly, studying me like she was trying to figure out if I'd grown even just a little since our first conversation. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "I like that you're not trying to win. Most men try. To win me, you're just showing up." That line split something open inside me, not because it was romantic, but because it was true. I'd spent so much of my life trying to earn affection through performance, trying to be impressive enough, clever enough, strong enough, and here, she was handing me permission to stop performing. She turned finally and walked inside. I followed her down the hall, not saying anything, but knowing something had shifted. At her door, she paused again. Then slowly, like she was testing the air between us, she reached out and touched my face. Her fingers were soft, warm, not hesitant. She let them rest there for a moment, just beneath my jaw, before saying goodnight and closing the door with a soft click that landed in my chest like a full stop at the end of a sentence I didn't want to finish. I stood there for a few seconds, then backed away. My heart beating in that awkward rhythm where your body is 2 steps ahead of your mind. In my room, the ceiling didn't have answers. The walls didn't echo any wisdom, but the silence didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt full, like something had been planted, and I just needed to let it grow without tugging at it every 5 minutes to make sure it was still alive. I didn't sleep much that night, not out of unrest, but awareness. I was more awake than I'd been in years, not because of adrenaline, but because something in me had started to settle. I didn't know where this was going. I didn't even know if it could go anywhere, if she'd stay, if I'd stay, if this was just a fleeting connection framed beautifully by the illusion of travel and time. But I knew this. She had become real to me, not as an idea, not as a fantasy, but as a mirror showing me parts of myself I'd forgotten or avoided or buried, and that, I knew, was something I couldn't walk away from not without finding out what it really meant. The next day came with gray skies and a stillness that felt deliberate, like the city itself was waiting for something to break. I stayed. In bed longer than usual, listening to the occasional creak of floorboards above me, the clatter of a plate in the shared kitchen, the low buzz of life outside my door that I wasn't quite ready to rejoin. I didn't know if she was awake, or if she'd already gone out, or if she was just sitting somewhere in the building, reading quietly like she often did, carrying that expression that made it look like she knew something you didn't, but wasn't going to say it until you were ready to hear it. I kept thinking about the way her hand had touched my face the night before, how simple it had been, how unearned it felt, how different it was from the way people usually reached for each other when they wanted something. Her touch hadn't asked anything of me. It had just seen me. And now I didn't know what to do with that kind of recognition. Not in theory. In practice, when I finally stepped into the hallway, she was there, coming from the opposite direction. We both paused, and for the first time since we met, the air between us felt uncertain. Not cold, not distant, just fragile. Like we'd crossed some invisible threshold and neither of us had quite figured out the footing yet. She greeted me. Like normal, but there was something different in her tone, warmer maybe, but more contained. I asked if she wanted coffee. She said she'd already had some. We ended up in the courtyard anyway, sitting side by side on that same bench, surrounded by wilted herbs and too much silence. I tried to say something casual, something light, but it didn't land. She was too present, too tuned in. She asked what was on my mind, and I made the mistake of deflecting, trying to brush it off with a shrug. But she didn't let it slide. You get quiet when you're scared. It's obvious. I froze because no one had ever called me out like that without making it sound like a criticism. With her, it just sounded like fact, so I told her. I said, I didn't know how to do this, how to be in something that didn't come with a script, that didn't ask me to play a part, that didn't reward me for hiding the mess. Said I was afraid of wanting her, not because of the age difference, not anymore, but because it felt so real I couldn't control it. And when I couldn't control things, I either ruined them or ran. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, so don't ruin it. And don't run. Like it was that simple. And maybe for her it was. She'd had years to learn that most of the things we fear don't actually need to be faced. I hadn't learned that yet. I still thought tension meant danger. Still thought discomfort meant something was wrong. But what if it didn't? What if this knot in my chest, this pull toward her wasn't a warning? What if it was just the feeling of becoming? Later that day, we walked to a museum, one she'd mentioned wanting to see. The exhibits were slow and sprawling, mostly photography, mostly faces. We moved through them at different paces, occasionally pointing things out, but mostly keeping our own rhythms. I watched her more than I watched the art, watched how she moved, how she lingered, how she tilted her head when something caught her attention. There was a stillness to her that wasn't passive. It was active, intentional, like she was always listening for something deeper, something just under the surface of things. And I realized then that I wasn't intimidated by her edge. I was intimidated by her clarity. By the way, she didn't need validation from me or from anyone. I didn't know how to meet that. I only knew how to seek it. And that imbalance made me feel like a kid in grown-up shoes. After the museum, we sat on the steps out front, eating warm bread we'd picked up from a vendor on the way. The sun had broken through the clouds, and for a few minutes everything looked golden, like someone had put a filter over the world. She asked if I felt better. I said I wasn't sure. Asked if she ever doubted herself. She said constantly that she didn't let doubt make her decisions anymore. She let it ride in the back seat, not drive the car. That made me laugh. And then more seriously, I asked why she was spending time with me. Why she hadn't pulled away when she saw how unsteady I was. She looked at me like I'd just asked something sad. Then she said, because I like the way you're trying. Most people stop trying after 30. That landed hard. Not because it hurt, but because it was true. We didn't kiss that day. We didn't touch. But something in us shifted. She didn't baby me. She didn't coddle me. She didn't make space for my fear like it was a fragile child. She made space for me to outgrow it. And that, more than anything, made me want to stay. The weather turned the next day. Not suddenly, but slowly, like the sky had been holding. Something in for too long and finally couldn't pretend anymore. A light drizzle came first, soft enough that the cobblestones just darkened rather than shined. And then a persistent wind that pushed papers and hair and people into corners of cafes and under awnings. I found myself standing by the hostel. Window mid-morning, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, watching as the city moved in slow motion beneath umbrellas and wet jackets. There was something about the change in the air that matched the unsettled part of me. I hadn't seen her yet that day. It wasn't unusual. We didn't have a routine, not really. But for the first time since we met, the space between us felt stretched, like both of us were holding our breath about something but pretending not to. I kept hearing her voice from yesterday, how she spoke about doubts sitting in the back seat instead of driving. I wanted that same clarity. I wanted to stop. Treating my feelings like strangers knocking at the door and start letting them in. Messy and unexpected. But even as I thought it, I felt the hesitation crawling back in. Around noon, I walked into the kitchen and saw her there, standing at the counter with her back to me, pouring hot water over a tea bag in that slow, steady way she had of doing everything. She turned when she heard me and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something was off. Not distant, but held. Like she was containing something she hadn't decided to share yet. I asked if she wanted to go out. She said she wasn't feeling it today, said the rain made her want to stay still. She offered me tea, and I said yes, even though I didn't want it. We sat across from each other at the table, both of us holding warm mugs like they were shields. And the silence between us wasn't comforting this time. It felt loaded. I asked if something was wrong, and she said no, but the kind of no that comes too fast, too practiced. I didn't push, not right away. But inside, the question kept looping. Had I done something? Said something? Or was this just her pulling back because she'd gotten too close? After a while, she stood up, said she was going to her room to read. I told her I might go for a walk, rain or not. She nodded, paused, then said, "Don't get too wet," was the kind of phrase people throw out without thinking. But the softness in her voice made it land heavier than it should have. I left the hostel and wandered through the streets without a plan. The rain light but persistent, soaking through the cuffs of my jacket and the tops of my shoes. I found a bookstore and stayed there too long, flipping through pages I didn't absorb, glancing at my phone every 10 minutes as if I expected a message that would never come. Eventually, I bought a novel I'd never heard of and walked back, telling myself I wasn't avoiding her, just giving space. But the truth was, I didn't know what kind of space she needed, and worse, I didn't know if it was the kind she came back from. By the time I returned, it was late afternoon. I went to the courtyard, hoping maybe she'd be out there, notebook open, pen moving like usual, but the bench was empty. The air was thick, and the vines hung low from the weight of the rain. I stood there for a while, then turned to go inside when I saw her at the edge of the hallway. She'd been watching. Not in a secretive way, just observing, like she was trying to decide something. I walked toward her, and she didn't move. When I got close enough, I asked again. Not directly, just as soft as "Everything okay?" She looked at me for a long time, then said, "I think I'm feeling more than I planned to." Tightened, not because it was bad news, but because it was the first truly vulnerable thing she'd said without wrapping it in wisdom or distance. She followed it with a quiet, and that scares me more than I expected. I told her I understood, that I was scared too, that whatever this was between us, it was starting to matter, and that mattered more than I knew how to handle. She let out a breath, one of those deep exhales that people do when they've been holding their spine straight for too long. Then she said, "You're younger." I told myself I wouldn't do this again with someone who still has so much left to prove. I nodded, knowing she was speaking truth, not rejection. I told her I wasn't here to prove anything, that I didn't. "Want to be another chapter she regretted or rewrote?" She shook her head and said, "You're not. That's the problem." And then, just like that, the room felt smaller, like we'd stepped into a space where every word had weight and none of them could be taken back. I didn't touch her, didn't move, stood there and let her feel whatever she was feeling. And in that stillness, I realized something that changed everything. She wasn't pulling away because I'd done something wrong. She was pulling back because, for once, something felt right, and that terrified her more than disappointment ever could. We didn't talk again that evening. After she walked away from that conversation in the hallway, the one where she admitted her fear, I didn't follow. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew better. You can't chase someone into clarity. They have to walk there on their own. And she was the kind of woman who didn't let herself be dragged by emotions until she understood what they meant. So I let her go. I went back to my room, sat by the window, and listened to the rain tapping soft against the glass like it was. Trying to fill the silence I was too restless to bear. I kept replaying her words in my head, the way her voice had softened on the edges. Not because she was fragile, but because she was holding something too delicate to speak louder about. She'd said I wasn't the problem, that I was the problem, because I wasn't a problem. That kind of sentence doesn't make sense until you've lived long enough to understand what it means to fall into something good after years of making sense of the broken. I laid on the bed with the lights off and tried to read, but every paragraph dissolved into thoughts of her. The way she walked, the way she didn't always meet my eyes when she was saying something true, the way she carried herself like a secret she'd already made peace with. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't perform emotion like people often do when they want to be understood quickly. She'll let it come slowly. I was learning how to match that pace, even though everything in me had been trained to rush toward resolution. I kept waiting for a knock, a text, something to tell me she hadn't disappeared fully into herself, but it never came. Eventually, I fell asleep with the light on, her voice still echoing in the spaces behind my ribs. Morning came like a whisper. The rain was gone, and the sky had cracked open just enough to let sunlight paint the walls in soft gold. I got up, showered, dressed, and went to the kitchen. She wasn't there. I checked the courtyard. Empty. For a moment I thought she might have left, packed her bag and vanished, the way people sometimes do when a moment gets too close. But then I heard her voice in the hallway, quiet but certain, speaking to someone at the front desk. She was still here, and something in me loosened. I waited until she came around the corner, and when she saw me, she paused. Not like she was surprised, but like she was checking to see if I still wanted to stand where I stood. I gave her a small nod, and she returned it. Then she walked past me, toward the courtyard, expecting me to follow. So I did. We sat side by side again, this time closer, not from intention, but from gravity. She didn't speak right away, and I didn't force it. Then, finally, she turned to me and said, "I used to think that love was supposed to make you feel like you were being swept away, that it had to hit hard and fast and make you question everything. But now I think maybe the real kind makes you stay still, makes you look at yourself, and that's scarier." I nodded, not just to agree, but because I knew exactly what she meant. I told her I'd always been drawn to the kind of love that demanded performance, that needed constant reassurance. But this thing with hurt didn't demand anything. It just waited. And that terrified me too. She reached over and took my hand, not dramatically, just simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Her fingers wrapped around mine with a calm that made my chest tighten. Then she said, "I'm not afraid of your age. I'm afraid of losing myself trying to make you comfortable with mine." Wanted to answer that right away. Wanted to say the right thing. The perfect line that would erase every trace of that fear. But nothing came. Because what she said was real. And real things don't get fixed with fast words. So I held her hand tighter. And I said, "Then don't lose yourself. Bring me with you." The quiet that followed wasn't heavy. It was needed. Like we'd both stopped trying to dance around the inevitable collision and finally let ourselves feel the impact. Not all collisions are destructive. Some shake loose the parts of you that were too stubborn to fall away. Some give you back pieces you didn't know you'd dropped. And sitting there with her, hand in hand, I realized that love, at least, this version of it, wasn't something we were falling into. It was something we were building, brick by brick, silence by silence, breath by breath. And maybe that's why it scared us so much, because it was sturdy, because it had weight, because it could last. That night came slower than the ones before, like the sun itself wasn't ready to go down until we were. We didn't make plans. We didn't say we'd meet in the courtyard or the kitchen or at the front steps like the other evenings had somehow taught us to do without instruction. We just knew. I spent most of the day walking without purpose, letting the city stretch around me like a worn coat, familiar now in the way it breathed and turned and held its corners. I passed shops we'd already explored, faces we'd nodded at, staircases she'd paused on when her legs needed a break, doors she'd photographed for no reason other than they made her feel something. Everything felt touched by her, not in a possessive way, just layered, like I'd started viewing the entire landscape through the lens of her presence, and now it all looked different without her beside me. When I finally made it back to the hostel, she wasn't in the courtyard or the kitchen, but I knew she was nearby. Her room light was on, and that was enough. I went to mine, cleaned up, changed into something that didn't look like I'd worn it for 3 days, then sat on the edge of the bed, unsure of what the next move was supposed to be. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't trying to impress. But there was a quiet electricity inside me. It's the kind you feel when you're not anticipating something grand, but something real, something earned, something delicate and deep, and not dressed up in fireworks. I waited a little longer, then stepped out, walked down the hall, and knocked on her door. Softly, just once. A pause, then it opened. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask why I was there. She just stepped aside, let me in, and closed the door behind us with the same kind of grace she always carried. Like even silence was something she respected. Room smelled like herfant perfume, warm linen, something herbal. She'd lit a small candle on the desk, the wax pooling at the center, casting everything in flickering gold. She was wearing a loose gray sweater and the kind of pants you only wear when comfort matters more than structure. She looked at me and didn't smile, didn't fill the space with pleasantries. She just said, "Are you ready to stop circling this?" I said yes. That was it. The air changed. The distance we'd been carefully maintaining fell away. Not because it was time, but because it had finally outlived its usefulness. I stepped closer, not to invade her space, but to join it. She met me there. When we kissed, it wasn't cinematic. It wasn't slow motion or choreographed. It was honest, measured, like two people opening a door together after days of standing on opposite sides, pressing their palms to the wood, breathing in sync. Her hands slid up my arms, not possessively, but like she was anchoring herself to something steady.
Nice.
Mine found her back, the curve of her spine, the tension in her shoulders. We didn't rush. We didn't talk. We just stood there, letting the weight of the week, the pull, the questions, all of it, dissolve into something physical, something human, something that didn't need to be explained or defended. We made our way to the bed without words. She moved with intention, not hesitation, like she wasn't afraid of what this meant but was choosing it deliberately. I followed, not like a man expecting anything, but like one who knew he was being let in. Not just into a room, but into someone's quiet, someone's trust. And there's a kind of reverence in that. The kind of reverence that slows you down, that makes every movement feel like a sentence you don't want to rush to the end of. We undressed without drama. Her body, real and grounded, didn't ask for compliments. It asked for presence, awareness, for being met, not worshipped, not judged, not fantasized, just seen. Fully. And I did. The space between us was warm, her breath steady, her hands deliberate. It wasn't about release. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about arriving. About answering the question we hadn't asked out loud but had carried with us from that first conversation in the cafe. Can I trust you with my softness? Can I trust you not to run when I show you who I really am? And the answer in every touch, every glance, every exhale was yes. Afterward, we didn't speak for a while. Just lay there, tangled but not intertwined, the sheets half off the bed, her leg brushing mine, our chests rising and falling out of sync in the best way. She looked over at me finally and said, "This doesn't make it easier." And I nodded because I already knew. What we'd stepped into wasn't simple. It wasn't safe. But it was true. And I was finally starting to believe that truth was worth the risk of complication. I reached for her hand. She let me hold it. And in the silence that followed, everything was understood. Morning came with a kind of stillness that felt earned. Not the stillness of absence or silence, but of two people who had crossed something together and were now standing on the other side. Not entirely sure what to call it, but both aware it was real. The room was still dark when I opened my eyes. The candle long burned out, the scent of wax and her skin lingering in the sheets. She was facing away from me, one arm under the pillow, her back exposed just enough for me to see the slow, steady rise of each breath. I didn't move. I just watched her for a while, the weight of what had happened pressing against my chest in the quietest, most sacred way. It hadn't been dramatic. There hadn't been a moment of confession or a sweeping declaration. There had only been truth. Uncomplicated, unpolished, undeniable truth in the way we had chosen to step into each other. Inch by inch, with nothing more than presence and the kind of trust that doesn't come from knowing someone long. It comes from seeing them fully. Eventually, she stirred, shifting beneath the blanket, her hand reaching for the space between us before her eyes had even opened. When she found my arm, her fingers curled around it lightly, like a reflex, like her body knew I was still there before her mind did. That simple gesture hit me harder than anything the night before, because it wasn't passion, it was instinct. I wasn't a guest in her bed. I wasn't a surprise. I was someone she had made space for, and now that space had shape. She turned toward me, eyes half-lidded with sleep, and for a long moment we didn't speak. We just looked at each other. In that soft, unguarded way people do when the world hasn't crept in yet. I think we both knew that as soon as one of us spoke, reality would return. Not in a bad way, just in a way that required us to move again, to name things again, to decide again what we were doing. When she did speak, it wasn't about the night before. It wasn't even about us. She just said she was hungry, that maybe we should find a bakery before the rush. Smiled at that. How ordinary it sounded. How gentle. There was no pressure in her tone. No shift in dynamic. No sudden need to define anything. Just breakfast. Just a next step, I realized as I watched her sit up and pull her hair into a loose knot. That this was how she did everything. Intentionally. Without force. She didn't need to stake a claim or build a structure around what we were. She just wanted to see where the road would go, and if I was still walking beside her by the end of it. And maybe that was enough. We got dressed slowly, passing clothes and smiles without words, the kind of ease that felt more intimate than anything physical. I followed her into the hallway, our steps quiet, the hostel still half asleep around us. The air smelled like coffee and fresh laundry, the kind of familiar scent that makes you forget where you are for a second. Outside, the city was just beginning to wake, vendors dragging carts into position, shutters being unlocked, the low hum of mopeds cutting through the stillness. We walked without touching, but close enough for our shoulders to brush now and then. And each time they did, it reminded me we weren't pretending anymore. We'd stepped past the edge and now we were inside something real, even if we hadn't figured out what to name it. The bakery she led me to was small, tucked between two buildings like it didn't want to be found. We ordered espresso and fresh bread, then sat at a table near the window, watching the street come alive. She tore her bread into pieces, dipping it in oil and humming something under her breath I couldn't quite place. I asked her what she was thinking. She looked up, considered for a second, then said, "That I feel calm, which is rare and strange and beautiful." I nodded because I felt the same. There was no drama in the air between us, no confusion, just calm. That kind of settled energy that comes when neither person is trying to win or explain or reach too far into the future. We talked about small things, her favorite coffee shop back home. The way Portuguese bread reminded her of something her grandmother used to make. I told her about a trip I took as a kid that I barely remembered, except for the smell of oranges on my fingers. It was light, it was mundane, but it mattered, because it was rooted in now, in sharing, showing up. And as we sat there, I realized I wasn't waiting for the next big moment. I wasn't anticipating a shift or preparing for the other shoe to drop. I was just with her, fully present, and for someone like me who had built entire years around. The art of preparing for departure, that was the most unfamiliar, most terrifying, most peaceful thing in the world. After breakfast, we walked again, not with purpose, just with presence. She slipped her arm through mine as we crossed a street and didn't let go when we reached the other side. And in that, a simple act, I felt something settle inside me. We didn't need to define it yet, We just needed to keep showing up. The peace didn't shatter all at once. It never does. It started small, like a faint vibration under the floorboards of a quiet house, barely noticeable unless you're paying attention. Even then, easy to ignore if you want to pretend everything is still intact. That morning had been beautiful. The walk, the bakery, her arm in mine. We moved through the city like we belonged to a tour, maybe like it belonged to us for a little while. There was no tension, no expectation, just the rhythm of two people finding their stride. We returned to the hostel just before noon, lighthearted and a little sun-warmed, and went to our rooms without much ceremony. She said she needed a shower. I said I might journal or nap. It was normal. It was easy. But normal is a tricky thing when you've built a connection on depth and presence, because eventually life asks you if what you've built can survive a crack. It started when I checked my email. It's a simple refresh, a reflex more than a need. I hadn't really been working since I arrived in Lisbon. I had left everything back. Home on pause, convinced I'd deal with the aftermath later. But there it was, a message from a potential client I'd spoken 2 weeks ago. He was offering me a short-term contract in Berlin. Well-paid, creative, immediate. I stared at it for longer than I needed to, rereading the offer. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I knew exactly what it meant. A few days ago, I would have jumped on it without thinking. It was perfect. Or at least it had been. Before her, before late-night conversations and courtyard silence and line-scented mornings and the slow unraveling of every version of myself, I had tried to hide from the world. I closed the email, then opened it again, then closed it. By the time I saw her again, it was late afternoon. She was in the courtyard, barefoot, curled up with a book and a half-finished glass of wine on the bench. She looked so at ease, so grounded, like the city had bent itself around her to keep her in focus. I sat beside her, and she greeted me with a smile that was soft and curious. I could feel the question forming behind her eyes. Something in me was off, and she knew it. But she didn't ask, not right away. Instead, we talked about dinner, about maybe going to the river, finding seafood, and watching the lights come. Up across the water, I agreed, nodded, but my voice didn't carry the same weight it usually did. That was all it took for her to set the book down, turn toward me, and say, "What's going on?" I told her about the email, the job, the timing. I didn't dress it up or down. I just laid it out, like facts on a table between us, watching her eyes move as she absorbed the shape of it. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer advice. Just asked how I felt about it, and that question hit harder than I expected. Because I didn't know how to answer, I said I was conflicted. It was a great opportunity, that Berlin wasn't far, that I wasn't looking to run. But even as I spoke, the words tasted thin, like excuses stretched over feelings I hadn't quite unpacked. She didn't interrupt, didn't fill the silence. When I finally stopped talking, she said, "You don't owe me a reason to go, but you do owe yourself the truth about why you'd leave." That line settled in me like a stone. Not heavy, but permanent. She wasn't asking me to stay. She wasn't guilt-tripping me. She was reminding me of the very thing that drew me to her in the first place, the space to choose. I sat with that for a while, watching her sip her wine. The way the sunlight lit her collarbone, the way her fingers curled around the stem of the glass. And I realized I didn't want to be anywhere else. But I also didn't want to lose who I was trying to become. And that was the tension. It wasn't between us. It was inside me. We went to dinner anyway, sat by the river like we planned. Ordered grilled fish and white wine, and let the conversation wander into safer places. She didn't bring up Berlin again. I didn't either, but it hovered. It's not like a fight waiting to happen. More like a truth waiting to be faced. I wanted to reach across the table, take her hand, promise her something. But promises felt too heavy, too final. So I just looked at her. Memorized the curve of her smile, the way she laughed with her whole face when something actually amused her. I watched her eat, talk, stretch, laugh, and all I could think was, how do I leave this? And more importantly, why would I? That night we didn't sleep in the same bed. She said she needed time to think. And I understood. Not because we were falling apart, but because something important had shifted. When I reached my room, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the city lights blink like distant stars, wondering what part of me still believed that running toward opportunity had to mean running away from intimacy. And the hardest question of all, the one I'd been avoiding since I opened that email, was this. Did I still believe that freedom meant leaving before things got too real? The truth was, I didn't know how to make both things true at once. I wanted her. I wanted this life. But I also wanted to keep building something of my own, something that proved I was still becoming. And maybe that's what scared me most. That loving her meant I had to trust I wouldn't lose myself in the process. That I could keep choosing her, not instead of myself, but with myself. And in that messy, beautiful uncertainty, I finally began to understand the shape of what we were holding. Something rare, something worth pausing for, something worth deciding for, again and again, not just once. The next morning felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. Not because she was gone, she wasn't. Not because something had been said that couldn't be taken back, nothing had. But because space, when it comes after closeness, has a way of echoing louder than absence itself. Her door stayed closed longer than usual, and I didn't knock. Not out of pride or fear, but because something in me knew this wasn't the kind of moment that needed movement. It needed stillness. I sat in the kitchen, swirling cold coffee in a chipped mug, staring out the window at a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be blue or gray. Lisbon had a strange way of reflecting you back at yourself, never directly, but in fragments. The uneven bricks, the twisted alleyways, the balconies with clotheslines swaying like stories half told. You could walk for hours and still feel like the city knew something about you that you hadn't figured out yet. And today, it felt like it knew I was standing at some invisible threshold, and that whichever way I leaned might change something. I wouldn't get back. Eventually, she came out. Calm, collected, wrapped in a scarf, even though the sun had finally returned. She made tea, not coffee, and sat at the opposite end of the communal table. There was no tension in her face, but there was a kind of focus, like she'd spent the night wrestling with something and had finally pinned it down. I waited, not because I expected a declaration, but because I could feel something rising to the surface, and I didn't want to interrupt its climb. She spoke first carefully, like each word had been measured before it left her mouth. She said she wasn't asking me to stay, that she would never want to be the reason I missed out on something that might move me forward. But then she said, I also won't pretend this hasn't mattered to me. And those words, simple, honest, brave, cut through me more deeply than I was ready for. Because that's the hardest kind of truth to hold. The one that doesn't beg, doesn't guilt, doesn't demand, but still lands like a weight you didn't know you were carrying until someone handed it to you with both hands. I told her I hadn't made a decision, that I was stuck between two versions of myself, the one that chased the next thing, always afraid of standing still too long, and the one that, for the first time, wanted to root into something not because it was perfect, but because it felt true. She nodded. She didn't try to fix that tension. She just said, then be still until the right version speaks louder. And that sentence lodged itself in my chest like a slow-burning ember. It didn't offer a solution. It offered permission. The rest of the day passed quietly. We walked together, but not hand in hand. We ate lunch at a market, sharing bites and sips, but not conversation. The closeness wasn't gone, but it had shifted. We were in the part of connection most people skip over: the waiting, the wondering, the breathing through the discomfort of not knowing. That night I wandered alone. Not because I needed space from her, but because I needed space within myself. I ended up at a lookout point we'd passed days earlier.
Oh, the one with the crumbling stone ledge and the view of rooftops that stretched out like waves.
I stood there watching the city glow, thinking about all the times I'd walked away from. Things that felt too big to carry, not because they weren't beautiful, but because I'd convinced myself that beauty came with an expiration date, and that holding on to something too tightly only made it rot faster. But now I wasn't sure. She had shown me a different kind of beauty, one that didn't demand to be captured, one that asked to be witnessed, respected, chosen again and again, without pressure or performance. And maybe that's why I was scared, because it meant I had to stop living in the metaphor of almost. When I returned to the hostel, the hallway lights were dim. Her door was cracked open, just enough for me to see the edge of her bed. The curve of her shoulder beneath the blanket, her notebook on the nightstand, a pen resting on the page like she'd fallen asleep mid-thought. I stood there for a long time, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I finally knew exactly what mattered. I wasn't ready to leave, not yet. Maybe not for a while. I wasn't done with Lisbon. But more than that, I wasn't done with her. Not just because I wanted more time, but because I wanted more truth. The kind you don't get in a few weeks. It's the kind you build slowly, with presence, with patience, with the kind of vulnerability that most people run from because it asks to. Much and promises nothing. I went to bed and wrote for the first time in days, not just notes or fragments, but a full page. Wrote about the way she listened. About the way her silence taught me more than most people's declarations.
About
how choosing to stay wasn't about abandoning ambition, but about redefining what it meant to grow. Because maybe growth wasn't always forward. Maybe sometimes it was deeper, inward, rooted. I fell asleep with the pen still in my hand, the words still echoing in my head. And when morning came, I knew I would stay. Not forever. Not with conditions, not because I was afraid to leave. Because for once, something inside me had stopped running, and I wanted to see what happened if I let that part of me lead. When the sun came up the next morning, it wasn't dramatic. It filtered in through the blinds in thin, dusty lines, falling across the wooden floor of the room like it had a job to do, but wasn't in any particular hurry. I sat up slowly, the notebook still beside me on the bed, its last sentence unfinished because I'd fallen asleep mid-thought. But the decision I'd reached before drifting off hadn't dissolved with sleep. It sat inside me now like something planted, quiet but firm, not blooming yet but ready to. I stayed there for a while, legs stretched out over tangled sheets, feeling the weight of clarity settle deeper. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't unsure. I didn't have a speech prepared. There was no need to rehearse what I felt, because for the first time in years, my feelings weren't fighting each other. I wasn't at war with desire and fear. I wasn't trying to measure whether the risk was worth it. I already knew it was. Because peace like this wasn't something you stumbled across often, and when you did, you didn't analyze it to death. You honored it by choosing it, by standing in it and saying, "This is mine, and I'm not walking away from it just because." It doesn't fit the timeline I once imagined. I waited a bit, letting the hostile quiet shift into its usual rhythm, doors creaking. Footsteps overhead, the clink of dishes in the kitchen downstairs. Then I stood, dressed, and stepped out into the hallway. Her door was closed, but I didn't hesitate. I knocked once lightly, not like a person needing access, but like someone who already belonged there and was just respecting the space. A pause. Then the sound of movement. Then the door opened. She was standing in front of me in a robe, her hair pulled up, skin soft and bare of anything but light. Her face held no expression for the first second, like she was trying to prepare herself for either outcome, like her heart knew we were on the edge of something. I met her eyes and didn't drop them. No smile, no performance. His presence. I told her I wanted to stay, just like that. I said I wasn't taking the job, that Berlin would be there later. Something real was already here. Didn't want to move toward anything else until I'd finished discovering this, whatever this was. Because it mattered. Because she mattered. And because I was tired of building a life full of motion and momentum, but no depth. She didn't answer right away. She looked at me like she was reading every word again. Slower this time, making sure they were meant to last. Then she stepped aside and let me in. The room was warm, lived in, the bed still messy, the scent of her tea drifting from a small cup on the windowsill. I sat on the edge of the bed, and she sat beside me. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. It wasn't silence meant to stretch. It was silence meant to settle. Like the earth was catching up with us. Then finally, she placed her hand over mine and said, "I didn't expect you to stay, but I wanted you to. I just couldn't ask. I've spent too many years asking people to meet me halfway, only to watch them retreat when they realized I wasn't." Moving backward, her voice didn't crack. It didn't need to. The strength in it made the words land harder. I told her she didn't need to meet me halfway, that I'd come as far as I needed to, not to save something, not to prove anything, because I wanted to know what it meant to stand still and be fully seen and to see her, not as a woman. With a past I was intimidated by, but as a person I was lucky to have met now, in this exact moment of my life. She leaned into me then, not to kiss me, not to start anything, just to rest. Her head on my shoulder, our hands still clasped. We sat like that for what felt like a long time. Outside, the street was waking up, people walking, bikes passing, dogs barking. The world was moving, but we weren't, and that felt right. Eventually, we made breakfast in the kitchen together. Nothing elaborate. Toast, fruit from the little market stall down the street. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, but it didn't feel small. It felt enormous, because this wasn't about adventure anymore. It wasn't about the thrill of newness. It was about building something right in the middle of the mundane. That's where the real story was, now in the rhythm of days shared. Without spectacle. Later, we walked. We didn't plan it. We just found ourselves out there, hands linked, the city stretching wide around us like it was giving us room to figure it out. We passed familiar streets and unfamiliar ones, talked about everything and nothing. She told me stories from her 20s she'd never mentioned before. I told her about a dream I used to have as a kid, the one where I was always running through. An endless hallway, doors slamming shut behind me. She said maybe I wasn't running from something, but toward something I hadn't found yet. I laughed, told her maybe I'd finally stopped. She smiled but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both knew. That night, we returned to the same bench in the courtyard. The candle she always lit was already flickering. She leaned into my side, head on my chest this time, my arm around her. The air was cooler, but we didn't feel it. There was warmth now, not just between us, but within us. That kind of warmth. That doesn't demand anything loud. It just settles. That night, we didn't talk about the future. We didn't draw up a map or timeline or rules. We just stayed present, because presence, I was learning, was the thing I had always avoided out of fear. It's out of habit, out of not knowing how to hold it. But now I was holding it. It was holding me back. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to be. Anywhere else, it was 3 days later, when the quiet rhythm we'd found was interrupted. Not by us, not by fear, but by life, returning in its inevitable way. The way it always does after you've carved out some kind of bubble and convinced yourself it might just stay intact. Her phone buzzed at breakfast. Not a text, but a call. I could tell by the way her face shifted before she even answered that it wasn't casual. It was the first time I'd seen her look unsettled in days. She stepped away to take the call by the window, voice low, fingers pressed against the glass, as if grounding herself in the weight of what was being said. I didn't listen, not intentionally at least. But you can always hear enough when silence changes the shape of a room. When she returned to the table, she didn't explain right away. Just sat down, took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold, and stared into it like it might offer her an answer. I waited, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them take their time getting to the truth. Finally, she said her sister was arriving in Lisbon, not to visit. To stay, at least for a while. Some kind of medical situation, nothing terminal. But serious enough that her sister wanted to be near someone familiar while she figured things out. And that someone was Meredith. The silence after she said it wasn't heavy, but it was full. Full of everything she didn't want to say and everything I didn't want to pressure her into sharing. She didn't cry. She didn't fall apart. But her hands were restless on the table, her eyes scanning the corners of the room like she was cataloging the version of this space she had gotten used to before it changed. I reached across and placed my hand over hers. She didn't look at me, but she didn't pull away either. She just said, "It's going to get different. I don't know how yet, but it will." And I said, "Then we'll let it." Not because I knew how, not because I had some idea of what came next, but because loving her meant letting things be real, not just beautiful. That afternoon we didn't go out. We stayed in, folded laundry, made soup from leftover vegetables we'd almost forgotten about in the fridge. There was something strangely sacred about the simplicity of it, like we were practicing how to exist together, when things weren't perfect. She moved slower, more thoughtful. I could feel her mind drifting, but I didn't try to bring it back. I just stayed close, quiet, ready. By evening, she told me more. Her sister had always been fragile in ways Meredith had never learned how to be. Emotional, dependent, the kind of person who needed support in a way that was constant, exhausting. They loved each other, but the closeness always came with a cost. Meredith had spent most of her adult life establishing a kind of boundary between them, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. Now that boundary would be tested. She asked if I was planning to leave, not because she wanted me to, but because she was bracing for it. I told her the truth. I wasn't planning anything yet. I'd stopped planning the minute I chose to stay. That answer didn't fix anything, but it softened something in her. That night we didn't sleep in the same bed. Not out of conflict, but because she needed a kind of aloneness that wasn't about pushing away. It was about holding space for what was coming. I understood that. I needed that kind of aloneness too. Once, maybe more than once. The next morning, I woke to a note on my door. It said she'd gone to meet her sister at the station. It said she'd be back later. That I didn't need to wait, but she hoped I would. So I waited. Not like a man pacing. Not like someone counting the minutes. I waited the way you do when you know waiting is the most important thing you can offer someone who's trying to balance their old life with a new one. I went for a walk, bought groceries, picked up a book she'd mentioned at a little shop by the cathedral. I made dinner. Simple pasta, garlic, oil, a sprinkle of pepper, something warm, something that could sit for hours if it needed to and still be good. She returned just after dusk, her scarf tied tighter than usual, her shoulders drawn. I opened the door before she knocked. She didn't smile, not right away. But her eyes said thank you in a way that words never could. We ate without much conversation. She told me her sister would be staying at an apartment nearby. She'd helped her get settled. She'd be spending more time there in the next few weeks. Doctor visits, test results, check-ins. Her voice was even measured, but beneath it, I could feel the old patterns rising the way she stepped into caregiver mode so effortlessly it looked like choice, even though I knew it was habit. I asked if she needed help. She said not yet. Then paused. Then added, but I might, and I won't be too proud to ask, if that mattered. It mattered more than any promise she could have made, because it meant she saw me not as a guest in this life she was trying to maintain, but as someone who could shoulder some of the weight if she let me. Later that night, we sat on the edge of the bed together, shoulders touching, not speaking. Her hands were clasped in her lap, mine resting between us. After a while, she turned to me and said, "You didn't sign up for this?" And I said no, but I stayed for it. She leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "This might get hard," I answered. "Then let it." She let out a breath, not a sigh, just breath released. And in that moment, I think we both understood something we hadn't been ready to say out loud until now, that love doesn't always arrive dressed like romance. Sometimes it shows up wearing real life, wearing illness, wearing responsibility, wearing mornings that don't belong to just the two of you anymore. But if you're lucky, it still feels like yours. It rained for 2 days straight after her sister arrived. Kind of rain that doesn't crash but seeps, steady and cold, like the city had suddenly remembered it was built to carry sadness in its bones. The sky was a wall of muted gray, and the streets lost their color. Everything looked washed out. And maybe that's what those days felt like, washed out. Not bleak, but blank. Like we were being asked to hold space for something heavier than we could name. Meredith was gone most of the time, shuttling back and forth from the hostel to the apartment where her sister had set up camp just a few tram stops away. The first day she left early and came back late, face drawn, eyes tired, but still alert. The second day she didn't come back at all. It's just a message around midnight that read, "Staying with her tonight. Long day. Tomorrow." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew no response could carry what I wanted to say without making it sound like I needed something from her. And I didn't. I just needed her to be okay. I spent those hours moving slow, making tea I didn't drink, walking through the halls of the hostel like a ghost who knew the rooms too well. The space between us didn't feel like distance. Felt like breath being held. On the third day, she returned in the early evening. Soaking wet despite her coat, hair flattened, eyes rimmed with something fatigue couldn't explain. She looked like someone who'd just spent hours keeping themselves from falling apart for the sake of someone else. When she saw me, she didn't speak. She walked to me, leaned into my chest, and I wrapped my arms around her without thinking. Her body was tense, not shaking, but close to it. She wasn't crying, but the silence around her carried the weight of 100 unshed tears. We stood like that for minutes. She didn't let go, neither did I, and in that moment I didn't. Need an explanation? I just needed to stay right there, holding steady until she could begin to breathe normally again. Later, when we finally sat on the bed, she told me the doctors had used the word degenerative, that her sister had more time than most, but not. As much as they'd hoped, there'd be treatment, therapies, tests, hope, yes, but not the comfortable kind, not the kind that wrapped you in good odds. She spoke slowly, carefully, like each sentence was a fragile thing she wasn't sure she should let out of her mouth. I listened, and for once, I didn't try to offer perspective. I didn't try to reframe it or soften it. I just let the facts land where they needed to land. And then I told her I wasn't going anywhere. She looked at me and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know how to let someone stay when things get this messy." I said, "Then don't let me. Just don't ask me to leave." Over. The next week, life took on a new rhythm, one that wasn't ours, but one we learned to share. She spent her mornings with her sister. Midday, she'd return to the hostel for an hour or two to rest or recharge or just not talk. Sometimes we'd sit in the courtyard together, not touching, not talking. Sometimes we'd lie on the bed in silence, our bodies side by side, letting the nearness be enough. Evenings were unpredictable. Some nights, she stayed with her sister. Other nights, she came back late, crawled into bed next to me, fully clothed, and fell asleep with her hand on my chest like she needed to know I was still there before she could let go of the day. I didn't ask for more, not because I didn't want more, because I understood that real love sometimes means holding the space without needing to fill it. One night she woke me up without meaning to. Her breathing was uneven, body tense. I sat up, asked if she was okay. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I feel like I'm failing her, like nothing I do is enough." And I told her the truth, that no one feels like enough in the face of someone else's pain. That showing up was the only thing that mattered. Thought she was doing it better than anyone else could. She didn't cry. She let her head fall into my shoulder, and I felt her entire body exhale against me, like maybe, for a moment, she believed. Me, I held her through the night. She didn't ask me to. I just did. Because that's what you do when the person you love is breaking in a quiet, exhausted way, and doesn't have the energy to say it out loud. Every day after that was different. Some better, some worse, but always real, always alive. And every night I stayed, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because no part of me wanted to be anywhere else. It was a Sunday when I met her sister. Meredith had asked if I could help her carry a few things, groceries mostly. Some odds and ends for the apartment, and without thinking, I'd said yes. She hadn't asked before. Until then, our arrangement, if you could call it that, had been clearly unspoken. Her world with her sister was hers alone, and I didn't push past that line. But the invitation arrived without tension, without pause, and I knew it meant something was shifting. The walk there was quiet, the two of us side by side with bags in hand, the sun peeking through after 3 days of stormy skies. The streets were unusually still for a Sunday, and I think we both felt it the way the city was giving us room. I didn't ask what her sister knew about me. I didn't ask if she had told her anything. There was no use trying to prepare for someone's reaction to a truth you'd only just begun learning how to hold yourself. When we arrived, her sister was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a long sweater, thin but elegant, her posture straight, despite the fatigue that seemed to cling to her skin. Her face was familiar in an unfamiliar way, like a photo of Meredith taken decades ago and left out in the sun just long enough to fade. She greeted me with a smile that felt too wide to be effortless, but too warm to be fake. Her eyes scanned me once, not like an inspection, more like a note. I stepped inside, and immediately I could feel the difference. The apartment was neat, orderly, every object in place, every corner softened with light or fabric. There was no chaos here, only control. The kind of control that came from someone trying to feel safe in a body that wasn't cooperating anymore. We helped her unpack the bags, and then Meredith made tea, while her sister and I sat on the small balcony. The silence was short. She asked me how long I'd been in Lisbon, and I told her. She asked if I was traveling for work or pleasure, and I said neither, not anymore. She looked at me again, longer this time, then said, "So you're staying for her?" I nodded. I didn't elaborate. She didn't need me to. There was no surprise in her expression. Just something else, something quieter, she said. Doesn't let people in easily. Never has, especially not when things get messy. I told her I knew that. That I wasn't trying to save her or solve her. I was just trying to stay close. She sipped her tea and said, "Good, because if you were trying to fix her, I'd have to ask you to leave." The honesty landed like a stone in my stomach, not heavy, but grounding. I respected it. I respected her. And then she added something. That caught me off guard, she said. I don't think she realizes it, but she's already started changing. I asked what she meant, and she said, "You've made her softer, not weaker, just less guarded." She smiles differently, like dada 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 dada. Like she means it, like she's not apologizing for it. I didn't know what to say to that. It felt too big, too kind, too dangerous to believe in entirely. But she wasn't finished. She said, "I think she's scared because she knows she'll have to choose. Again soon, and this time the decision isn't just about me. It's about her, her future, her comfort, her fear." Before I could respond, Meredith stepped out onto the balcony, 2 mugs in hand, her face flushed from the steam. She didn't ask what we were talking about, and her sister didn't offer it. The 3 of us sat there for a while, not quite a family, but something adjacent, something quiet and close and stitched together by this strange intersection of care and grief and transition. I watched the way they looked at each other so, different but still bound. I saw the way Meredith's shoulders relaxed when her sister laughed. I saw the way her sister leaned closer when Meredith spoke. And I realized something then. This wasn't just a chapter of someone else's story that I'd wandered into. I was becoming part of it, whether I had a label or not. Later, as we walked back to the hostel, Meredith was quiet again. Her hand brushed mine now and then, but she didn't reach for it. I didn't force it. When we reached the front steps, she paused, looked at me, and said, "She likes you." I smiled and said I liked her too. Something was behind her eyes, something pulled tight. I asked if everything was okay. She said yes, but it came out too fast. I didn't press, just nodded. That night she didn't come to my room, didn't send a message. I lay in bed wondering if I had said something wrong. Her sister's words had unlocked something she wasn't ready to face. But deep down, I knew this wasn't retreat. This was processing. Meredith didn't run. She unraveled carefully, and I had learned how to wait. Meredith didn't speak about it the next day. Not the balcony conversation. Not her sister's comments. Not the subtle shift that had entered the space between us like a breeze from a window left cracked open overnight. She came back to the hostel around midday, tired but composed, her eyes carrying the weight of someone who had been asked too many questions and hadn't, yet decided which ones she wanted to answer. We sat in the courtyard like we had so many times before, the sun warming the backs of our necks, the sound of the city moving lazily around us like a lullaby. Her notebook was open in her lap, pen in hand, but she wasn't writing. It's just holding it there like a lifeline, like if she stared long enough, the words would organize themselves and offer her something close to peace. I didn't ask her anything. I didn't press. I had learned that Meredith processed in spirals, not lines, her thoughts looping and turning inward before rising back out with clarity. But even in her silence, I could feel something rumbling underneath. A tension not born. Of doubt, but of confrontation. Not with me, with herself. There was a kind of turbulence in her stillness that I had started to recognize. The way her foot tapped sometimes when she was trying to pretend she was calm. The way her fingers moved across the edge of the paper, like she was tracing something invisible. I could feel her weighing everything, trying to measure whether what she was starting to feel could stand beside what she already knew. She was a woman who didn't rush into anything lightly, and that was what made everything between us feel heavier, now not harder, but more significant. She stayed at the hostel that night, came to my room with her hair still damp from the shower, wearing one of those oversized shirts she never wore in public, carrying a quiet vulnerability in the way she walked, like every step was being negotiated internally.
Ow.
We didn't speak. Much. She climbed into bed and rested her head on my chest, fingers grazing my ribs like she was searching for the rhythm of something steady. I wrapped an arm around her without thinking, and she let out a breath that told me she'd been holding one since morning. Hours passed like that. Neither of us sleeping, neither of us needing to fill the silence with anything more than presence. And at some point, just before the sky began to fade from black to blue, she whispered something so quietly I almost missed. She said. I don't know how to do this. And I knew she wasn't talking about us. Not exactly. She was talking about the part that came after. The part where things get real, where the soft beginnings turn into sharp corners, and the questions get heavier, and the choices stop being hypothetical. The part where it's no longer about connection, but continuity. The next morning, she was gone again before I woke. Her notebook was gone too. I found myself walking without a plan, wandering through the older parts of the city, kind of streets that demanded nothing but your time. I passed murals and cathedrals, old women hanging, laundry, tourists snapping pictures of buildings they didn't understand. My feet carried me farther than I expected. And eventually, I found myself at the lookout where we'd first watched the sun go down together. Back when everything between us had still been new and wide open, I sat there for a while, letting the wind push at my shoulders, trying to remember what it had felt like in those early days before choices needed justifying. Before life had re-entered the room, and I realized something that made my stomach turn in that quiet, settling way that happens when you finally admit something to yourself. I loved her, not in the way people say they love someone they're drawn to. I loved her in the way that made time irrelevant, in the way that made distance feel pointless, in the way that made compromise feel like freedom instead of sacrifice. And more than that, I was terrified that she would choose to let me go. Not because she didn't feel the same, but because she'd spent so many years protecting the part of herself that believed she was safest alone. What scared me most wasn't that she would decide I wasn't right. It was that she would decide she didn't deserve something that didn't require effort to be valid. Meredith wasn't unfamiliar with love, but I had come to understand that she was deeply unfamiliar with ease. She knew how to work for things, how to hold her own weight, how to protect herself through silence. But I don't think she knew yet how to fully receive something without holding up a mirror and asking, why me? And maybe that's what I had to accept too. That part of loving her meant giving her room to unlearn all the survival skills that had kept her from letting herself belong to something. That part of this would be standing by while she fought. Battles I couldn't see, couldn't fight, but could only witness. Later that day she returned. Found me in the kitchen chopping vegetables like I had nothing to distract me but the motion of the knife. She stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking. I didn't look up. I just kept chopping, not out of avoidance, but because I wanted her to come to me fully, not just partway. And when she did, when she crossed the threshold and sat beside me and said my name, it wasn't soft. It wasn't guarded. It was steady. She told me she'd gone for a walk too, that she'd gone back to the river. She sat on a bench for nearly an hour watching two strangers hold hands and realized she couldn't remember the last time. She'd let herself want something without immediately building a wall around it. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said, I keep waiting for someone to give me permission to choose joy. And I think maybe I've been asking the wrong people. Finally stopped chopping, set the knife down. Turned toward her and saw it in her eyes. The fear, yes, but also the release. She was trying, not for me, for her. That was all I needed. We spent the evening on the rooftop. No wine, no distractions. Just us in the last stretch of daylight, folding itself into the skyline. She didn't ask for reassurance. I didn't offer any. We sat with the unknown between us like it was something holy, because it was. Because sometimes love isn't about solving or even staying. Sometimes it's about being willing to let someone find their own way while you hold the light. It's just long enough for them to see the path beneath their feet, and I would keep holding it for as long as she needed. Because I wanted her to owe me anything, but because I knew what it felt like to be in the dark and have no one waiting at the end of it. The following morning carried the kind of silence that comes before something is said out loud that cannot be unsaid. I felt it before I even opened. My eyes, the air in the room had a certain weight to it. It's not heavy, but dense, like a fog that had settled without asking permission. I rolled over and found her already awake, lying on her back with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her expression unreadable in that way she had when she was thinking so deeply it was like her body had to shut down everything else, just to hold the thoughts steady. She didn't move when I stirred, didn't turn toward me, but her hand was resting close enough to mine that I could feel the shared warmth between us, just barely. I didn't speak, not yet. I knew better, whatever she was about to say it. Needed space? It needed silence. It needed the kind of quiet that lets truth land without bouncing off walls, still echoing with assumptions. I lay there breathing slow, letting my pulse settle into something calm, something grounded, something ready to receive. When she finally sat up, it was unhurried, deliberate, like each motion had been rehearsed in her mind before she allowed her body to follow through. She pulled the blanket with her, wrapped it loosely around her legs, and stared out the window for a long moment as if searching the rooftops for the language she hadn't yet found. I could feel the distance, now emotional distance, but the kind of space that forms when someone is on the edge of a decision and everything inside them is organizing for that final step. I knew what was coming. I didn't know the shape of it or the impact, but I knew we were on the verge of something irreversible, and I wasn't afraid. Not in the way I would have been before her. Not in the way I used to be when closeness meant uncertainty, and every silence felt like a setup for abandonment. With Meredith, I'd come to understand that the scariest thing about intimacy wasn't loss, it was the depth it pulled you into. The version of yourself it asked you to become if you were brave enough to hold your ground and stay present. Looked at me then, eyes clear, but softer than I expected, and without warning, without preface, she began to speak. She told me she'd spent the last 2 nights reliving her entire pattern, every man she'd pushed away before things got real. Every opportunity she'd stepped back from when it started to demand more than she was comfortable giving. Said she had convinced herself for years that staying in control was the same thing as staying safe. And that safety had been her religion for so long she couldn't imagine what it would mean to choose something that felt like risk. Even if the risk was love. She said she was tired of living in the space between almost and enough, that she had spent her entire adult life talking herself out of happiness because happiness wasn't familiar, and everything unfamiliar felt threatening. But then her voice cracked, just slightly, and she said, with this impossible vulnerability, "I don't want to leave this." And I could feel the ground beneath me shift in the best way possible. She said it clearly. She wasn't going to leave. Not me, not Lisbon, not this strange, tender connection we'd built without a plan. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to protect herself from something that had already proven it wasn't trying to hurt her. She said she didn't know what it would look like, didn't have the next 10 steps mapped out, didn't know how she'd balance being there for her sister and being here with me. But she was done trying to predict her way out of things that asked for presence, not perfection. And then she said, the thing that broke me open, in a way nothing else could. She said, "I want to learn how to stay with you, if you'll keep staying with me." I sat up then, moved beside her slowly, and I took her hand like it was something sacred. Because it was. Because those words weren't a confession. They were a commitment. Not to forever, not to a label, but to trying, to choosing, to beginning, again and again, even when the middle was murky and the end was unknowable. And all I could do, because words felt too small, was pull her against me, rest her head on my shoulder, and let her feel every part of me say yes. Not the loud kind of yes, not the performative kind. The quiet, grounded, irrevocable kind that comes from someone who has been running their whole life and finally decided that peace wasn't a place to visit, it was a person to stay beside. We didn't leave the room for hours. Not out of avoidance, but out of reverence. Talked about nothing and everything. About the past, yes. But more importantly, about what comes next. Not as a concrete plan, but as a shared willingness. We talked about morning routines and shared meals and what it might mean to build something in the in-between spaces of our lives. She talked about her sister, about the fear that still lingered, and I told her I wasn't here to fix any of it. I was just here to witness it, to walk through it beside her, one footstep at a time. That night we didn't say I love you. Not yet. We didn't need to. Because love, in that room, wasn't a phrase. It was a choice that kept making itself known every time we stayed, every time we leaned in, every time we breathed through the fear and into the possibility. And as we lay there, the light fading, the sky softening into that purplish hush that only comes after something big has been spoken, I realized that we weren't at the end of a story. We were finally at the beginning. The next week unfolded differently. The air had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, like the first signs of spring rising underneath winter's weight, not announcing themselves with flowers or color, but with the faintest suggestion that something buried was now pushing up through the dirt. Meredith was still spending time with her sister every day, but there was no longer that residue of distance when she returned. No emotional detachment lingering in her shoulders, no protective shield in her voice. She came back lighter even, on the hard days, and when she looked at me now, it was without hesitation. We had crossed a line together, not the kind drawn in moments of passion, but the kind built slowly, deliberately, forged through decision after decision to stay. Our mornings found a rhythm: coffee at the corner cafe, walks to nowhere in particular. Hours spent in bookstores, thumbing through covers we didn't buy, just so we could sit close and read. Paragraphs aloud, like they were spells. We didn't talk much about the future, not in terms of plans or destinations. But we spoke with the ease of people who now trusted that tomorrow would include both of us. Even if we didn't know what it would look like yet, then without warning, the past arrived. It came in the form of a name I hadn't thought of in weeks, a message buried in the cluttered inbox of an account I'd forgotten to mute. An old friend, a former collaborator from back home, someone I hadn't seen since I boarded the plane, to Lisbon with nothing more than a vague plan and a desire to outrun myself. He was in Portugal. Not just visiting, he was consulting for a short-term project in Porto, and wondered if we could meet halfway in Coimbra for a few days to catch up and maybe discuss something that had the tone of opportunity beneath it. Stared at the message for longer than I should have. Not because I didn't know how to respond, because I could feel the quiet tug in my chest of a version of me I had walked away from. The part of me that chased the next big thing, that believed motion was proof of purpose, that measured progress by how many cities I'd passed through or how many deals I'd made. That part of me had gone quiet in Lisbon, replaced by something slower, more grounded. But reading his message, I realized that part wasn't gone. It was dormant, waiting. I told Meredith about it that evening, sitting on the rooftop, legs crossed, a bottle of wine open between us. Her face didn't change. She didn't flinch. She listened the way she always did, completely, quietly, without inserting her fears into the space between my words. When I finished, she nodded slowly and asked what I was feeling. And the thing was, I didn't know. I didn't feel pulled toward the meeting, not exactly. But I didn't feel indifferent either. It wasn't about leaving her or leaving Lisbon. It was about something else. A question I hadn't asked myself in weeks. Who am I now when I'm not just trying to stay or run? Who am I when I'm not reacting but responding? She said. I didn't owe her any version of myself but the honest one, she said. She didn't want to be the reason I stopped being curious about what else might be waiting for me. But then she said, with a softness that felt almost too raw to bear, just don't forget who you've become here. I think that line landed harder than any request to stay would have, because it wasn't a plea. It was a reminder. It came from Love, not fear, so I went. Not to escape, not to chase, but to meet myself halfway. I took the train to Quingborough with a small bag, a journal, and a quiet sense of self-awareness that felt more like armor than luggage. The reunion with my friend was what you'd expect, full of energy. Familiar stories, nostalgic laughter. We talked about everything and nothing. About people we used to work with, places we used to pitch to, the next tech trend, the next pivot. And it wasn't bad. It wasn't even uncomfortable. But it felt like putting on a jacket that used to fit. And realizing the shoulders no longer sit quite right, he pitched me an idea, collaborative, exciting. It's a kind of opportunity that would have made me say yes without blinking a year ago. And as he spoke, I could feel the old patterns kick in. The part of me that wanted to prove I still had it, the part that wanted to impress. But then I thought of Meredith, of her laugh in the morning when she's still half asleep, of the way she listens without solving, of the quiet nights we've spent watching shadows on the ceiling like constellations we hadn't named yet, and I realized I didn't need this to feel whole anymore. I told him I'd think about it, and I meant it. But even as I said it, I knew my answer. I came back 2 days later. She was waiting in the courtyard, notebook in her lap, tea beside her, a small smile playing at her lips like she already knew what I would say. I sat beside her, leaned my head into her shoulder, and whispered that I didn't want to be the man who chased things just because they were shiny, that what we were building was the only thing I'd ever built that made me feel more like myself instead of less. She closed her eyes and said thank you, but not like someone receiving a gift. Like someone hearing a confirmation she'd already written in her own bones. We didn't talk about it again. We didn't need to. Because some decisions don't need to be declared, they need to be lived. And so we kept living, not perfectly. Not always peacefully, but with presence, with truth. With the knowledge that sometimes the biggest commitment you can make is not to a person or a plan or a place, but to the version of yourself who finally stopped running long enough to be seen. Some stories don't end. Not really. They just shift form. They slow down, soften, stretch into something quieter. Something less about what happens next and more about how you're choosing to live right now. That's what it became between us, not a love story with a dramatic ending, no last minute airport chases, no ultimatums shouted across train stations or bridges. It's just mornings that started with silence and tea, afternoons filled with shared space and gentle interruptions, evenings spent tangled in conversation or comfortable quiet. The rhythm of us wasn't one of grand gestures. It was built from the small, steady things that most people miss because they're too busy looking for fire instead of warmth. And yet somehow, we had built a fire anyway. One that didn't burn, out of control, but one we kept feeding together, carefully, patiently, with kindling made from choice after choice, to show up even when it would have been easier to pull away. Meredith never asked for more than I could give. She never asked for promises that extended past the horizon of what we could see, but what we gave each other daily, in fragments and full moments alike, was the truth, and that had become the most radical offering of all. We stayed in Lisbon through the fall. The air cooled, the days shortened, and still we lingered. Sister's condition stabilized, at least for a while, which meant the pressure of that responsibility no longer sat on her shoulders like an invisible weight. Meredith breathed deeper, laughed more. We still had hard days moments where her guard would return, where I'd feel the instinct to retreat or overthink, but we had learned how to name those things when they came. We had become fluent in each other's silences. We could tell when one of us needed space, and more importantly, we trusted it wasn't distance. It was just part of how we stayed whole, while still being close. People came and went at the hostel travelers, passing through, leaving behind bits of story and noise, but we remained. An unlikely constant in a place built for impermanence. And maybe that's what made it sacred, that we stayed. When everything around us said keep moving, we chose stillness. She took me to places she loved slowly, like unwrapping old photographs. There was a bookstore hidden behind a garden wall where the pages smelled like citrus and the owners knew her name. There was a painter who worked on his balcony shirtless, who waved to her every Thursday. There was a cafe with the best orange cake in the city, which she insisted on splitting because she said joy was always better shared. We made traditions that only made sense to us: Tuesday walks to the park even when it rained. Sunday breakfasts at the table by the window even. When someone else got there first, we adapted. We didn't make lists or resolutions or declarations. We lived like people who had once been afraid to trust what was good, but had finally decided it was okay to stop bracing for impact. My work changed. It slowed, then sharpened. I started writing more, not just about business, but about people, about what happens when you stop measuring life by productivity and start measuring it by connection. Meredith read everything I wrote, sometimes before I was ready for anyone to see it. She never critiqued, never offered advice unless I asked. She'd just underline sentences that landed and hand them back to me without a word, and that was always enough, because she wasn't there to validate me. She was there to witness. 2. Remind me that I was already enough, with or without the polished paragraph or the clever conclusion. I started to believe it. Slowly, unevenly, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't performing. I was just existing. And someone was staying through all of it. There was a morning in November that I remember more clearly than most. Had just started to climb over the buildings, casting that pale gold light across the courtyard. She was still sleeping, her face turned toward the window, one hand curled beneath her cheek. I sat beside her, watching the dust and the light, the way it danced with no need for direction, and I thought, this is it. It's not the destination, not the ending, just this. A moment held unremarkable on the surface, but everything in its stillness. I didn't need a ring, a title, a timestamp. I didn't need to post about it or name it or protect it from the world. I just needed to breathe it in, to remember it exactly as it was, quiet, full enough. We never made Lisbon permanent. That wasn't the plan. But the truth is, permanence stopped being the goal. Love wasn't in the address. It was in the way we kept showing up. Even when we were tired, even when the city changed, even when the calendar pages flipped and nothing looked like it had in the beginning. We knew we'd move eventually, maybe together, maybe in pieces, maybe in steps that didn't always land at the same pace. But the foundation had been poured, not in concrete. In presence, and you can carry that anywhere. In a bag, in a glance, in the way you pause before saying something sharp. The way you reach across the table instead of pulling away. That's what we had built. That's what lasted. And so this isn't the end. There is no end. There's just today and tomorrow. And the next time I find her in the kitchen humming under her breath, or the next time she finds me stuck on a sentence and places a cup of tea beside me without a word, we don't need to define it. We just need to keep doing it, the love. Staying the living of it all. Not perfectly, but fully. Together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.